Hello, I'm Dr. Tyler Desplena, and this is my book, Foundations of Strongman Training. I've used my scientific training to perform brand new research studies on the sport of strongman and combined it with over a decade of personal experience competing in strongman and powerlifting to teach you how to train like the strongest people on earth. I've decided to make a video series on the content of the book. I'm going to share with you everything from how the book idea came to be to practical considerations for the insights gained from these scientific studies. By the end of this video series, you'll have the information you need to optimize your strongman training. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. It's the final episode, episode 8 of the Foundations of Strongman Training video series. Today, we're going to talk about principles. Now, just to recap, if you missed the previous episodes, no problem. They're out there for you. I encourage you to go watch them. Just to recap a little bit, basically the last 7 episodes, I've taken you right from where I started, in my athletic journey as a kid, as a teenager, and given you everything that's brought me into the realm of strongman, all the scientific research I did, making the book and everything, all the studies, the results, and I packaged all that up in the last 7 episodes. But today, we're going to take a more practical approach and we're going to discuss principles, like I said. So basically, give you my thoughts, my recommendations about everything I've discussed so far and, drawing from my personal experiences in the sport, coaching people and so on, to try to take you through some examples and scenarios that you might find yourself in, whether you're a beginner, whether you're more advanced, and hopefully, help you optimize some of the training decisions that you need to make to, maximize your performance. So, when I started this journey with Foundations of Strongman Training, as I mentioned, I think in episode 2, the whole point of this for me was to answer some really fundamental questions that when I looked either in the literature, when I talked to people, they really didn't have good answers. People had anecdotes, right? What worked for them, what they heard from so and so that worked for so and so. But there wasn't anything for me that felt concrete and formal in terms of answers to what I think are, a set of very fundamental questions that, need answers. Or better way to put it is if you had the answers, you'd be able to get ahead quicker. And so that was my whole goal here. I did this selfishly so that I could try to optimize my training and get to my goals faster with less injuries, things like that. But along the way, I did these things, these studies that have never been done. And now I can, not only have I applied them myself, people I work with, but now I can share them with all of you. And so today's kind of like a culmination of all that. And I think this is fulfilling that original goal I had. But in case you're new here, you didn't watch the rest of the episodes, let me just recap about what the 4 fundamental questions that I started, this research with and that I went through answers for in the other episodes in the book. So let me just list those off for you real quickly. So the 4 questions are: what strongman skills must athletes master? What is the distribution of motion patterns in the sport of strongman? What's the distribution of effort patterns in the sport of strongman? And how often do successful athletes compete? And so the last 4 episodes were basically dedicated one study to each of those questions. So if you're curious about the details, I'm only, going to provide you some summary here, but please go back and watch them or, dig into the book, if you will. Now, before I list off the kind of principles that I've, culminated from this research, I want to just leave you with one note about it. So when you hear these principles, I highly suspect that you're going to say something like, well, obviously, or yeah, duh, like, of course, that's what the principle is. But I don't want you to take that as a negative. Actually, principles are supposed to be, simple and concise, and they're supposed to apply generally, right? That's essentially what a principle is in terms of whatever domain you're talking about. So they should seem obvious to you, and I hope that they do, right? I hope if you train for strongman, you've competed, you'll really connect with these. You go, oh yeah, of course, that's how I train, or that's how I make training decisions. That's how I structure my contests, so on and so forth. So just wanted to make that note before we get started, in case you start hearing them and you're going like, what is this guy talking about? So they should be simple. They should be clear. All right. So let me give you first an overview of the principles, and then I want to go into much more detail about each one, give you some, thoughts, discussion, recommendations, all that kind of stuff. Okay. So I'm just going to list them here and share a few words about each. Okay. Principle number one is that competing more frequently comes at the cost of training time. So in episode 7, the last episode, I discussed that there's this big trade off between competing and training time, right? So if everything else was taken care of, you could boil it down, and this is more the case for professional athletes. You basically have your time divided between fueling, recovery, training, and competing. And if you imagine the first two there, fueling and recovery, are kind of like set in stone, they're just like constant times, then really the two things you choose between are training time and competing, right? So that means that you have to be very diligent about making like a nice phasic structure that fits your contest goals and also your training goals. Obviously, they're related. And what's really important about this, or very another way to say is what's really challenging in the sport of strongman, is this is difficult because essentially no two contests are the same. Every contest will be different because there's no standardization of skills. Promoters have complete freedom to choose whatever they want. So it's just going to be, um, you know, a free form kind of thing that you're trying to optimize for. Basically, like you have these unknowns. A lot of times, as I discussed, you don't know the contest details until probably too soon before the contest. And you have to try to train in a way that optimizes you for a bunch of unknowns. Very hard to do. And then on top of that, the more you compete, the less training time you're going to have. And so these things make it very hard to build skills across time because there's lots of skills you got to master, as I talked in episode 4 about. And there's, risk of injuries and recovery and all these things to consider. So basically, that first principle is just to identify that there's this big trade off between competing and training. And so you need to find whatever balance works best for you, right? So that's the first principle to consider. Okay, principle number 2 is essentially that you can use training parameter generalizations to overcome the strongman uncertainty problem. In chapter 1 of the book, I laid out this idea of how much uncertainty there is in the sport. So basically, you have uncertainty because there's no standards of equipment, there's no standards of events or skills that can be tested. So that's some kind of uncertainty you have to account for. The other one is that basically every contest comes with a disclaimer that events are subject to change up to and during the day of the contest. So you might think you're squatting at the third event at the contest, and all of a sudden you have an axle clean and press for a maximum effort. Okay, so that makes it very hard, obviously, to optimize your training for. But I demonstrated in the book a couple of studies where I looked at the distribution of motion pattern and motion pattern classes and effort patterns and effort pattern classes. And I used those analyses as a way to overcome this uncertainty. So basically, in episode 5 and 6, I covered the details of this, but the essence of it is that you can use historical data to try to prioritize what you should train now, right? So what one of the conclusions was that the motion pattern class carrying, so which covers all carrying events. In the data set that I looked at, basically 25% or a quarter of all the skills that were tested fell into the carrying bucket or the carrying motion pattern class. So, with that in mind, to kind of generally prepare when you don't know what the exact skills are, you should spend 25% of your time getting good at carrying random heavy objects, right? So that's the kind of way you can overcome some of the uncertainty. And it's not perfect. The data I provided, they're averages, right? So you kind of got to take it as a baseline and always individualize, but it's a way to overcome this. So that's principle number 2. All right. Principle number 3 is something I hope a lot of you are doing. If you train strongman, you're probably doing this already, but that's train multiple strongman skills in a training session. Now, in episode 4, I mentioned that the average number of skills tested at a contest was 5. So you could have 4 events, but often one of them's a medley. It tests 2 different skills, right? So that's your 5. And that's pretty common for amateurs. Professionals often have more skills than 5, right? But five's the number that we can work with on average. So in order to replicate your contest conditions, you will want to train 5 skills in a session, right? And even like bonus points if you can pretend to have the same kind of warm-ups and timing between events that you would expect at the contest. If you've never done a contest, hard to figure it out. Get a hold of me. I'm happy to help you. But if you've done a contest, you kind of know about the timings based on how many people show up and different promoters and things like that. So trying to replicate that on training sessions is going to set you up for success, right? Practice how you play kind of thing, right? So one caveat I'll mention here, and we'll probably talk about a bit later, is that don't take this as to mean that every session you should be training 5 strongman skills. That's a great way to get injured very quickly, or at least burn out and not be able to recover between training sessions. Likely not a good idea, but some of your training sessions should have multiple strongman skills. And if even a few of them, a few times a year, have 5 skills, that's good. You're basically practicing how you want to play, right? So that's principle number 3. Train multiple strongman skills in some of your training sessions. All right, principle number 4. You should prioritize. Again, this is going to sound so obvious. I hope it hits you. Prioritize skills that occur more often in competition. Now, this isn't, strongman is not like powerlifting where it's the same 3 motion patterns, squat, bench press, deadlift, and the same effort pattern, maximum effort on all 3, right? And it's the same thing no matter if you want to powerlift here in Ontario or in China or in space, right? It's going to be the same rules essentially. Strongman is nothing like that. Strongman's the opposite, right? You could have all kinds of different skills, some motion patterns and the effort patterns, right? You could have like a log press for maximum effort, repeated effort, for fastest effort, like all these things. And then you could have all kinds of different pressing skills, and you see the combinations you can build. Now, that creates this huge amount of skills that you might have to master, but it's going to be impossible for you to master all of those, all the variations, and all the uncertainty. But what you can do, and what I presented here in the book in chapters, I think 2, 3, and 4, episodes 4, 5, and 6, was basically to just focus on prioritizing things that happen more often in competition. And this is especially important when you don't know the events of your upcoming contest. So again, we can look at historical data. Like I mentioned, carrying was 25% of what was tested across a whole bunch of contests and years. So we can prioritize that. And then obviously you could go deeper within carrying. You could prioritize the yoke and farmer's walk happen way more often than probably like a Husafel stone carry, right? at least for amateurs in your region, right? If you're a pro, maybe it's different. If you're a pro in Iceland, yeah, maybe it's different, right? Um, but that's principle number 4 is basically that whatever happens more often, you'll have a higher probability of success in your contest if you're training those and getting good at those things versus all the other skills that may or may not be tested, right? So if skills happen every year or they're tested every year, yeah, you should probably get on those, right? Um, and just for reference, there I laid out those kind of skills for amateurs in episode 4, and I talked about how there's basically these 14 foundational skills that I found in the data set there. So go check that out if you're interested. All right, last principle here. Principle number 5 is train a large variety of strongman skills. So in episode 3, I basically took you through this exercise. I also laid this out in the book to get a sense of what the size of the strongman skill set is or what it could potentially be. And I compared it to powerlifting and weightlifting, right? And just to give you, because those are people probably know more about those than strongman, and just gives you a really big contrast between the two. So basically, the conclusion was that there was like 800 and something potential skills in terms of what you're tested on and the related skills to build each of those tested skills versus powerlifting had like 18 or something, and weightlifting had even less than that, right? So there's this huge contrast between what you have to be good at, and it's why in strongman you hear this well-rounded term, right? That athlete was the most well-rounded, and that's why they won. So that I kind of laid out the exercise there, and then in episode 4, I as part of that study, I identified that for the amateur data set I had, there were 74 unique strongman skills, and that was just the motion pattern portion of it. So right there, across a 5-year period, you may have been tested on any of those 74 skills if you competed in all those contests, right? So that's already, I mean, you go out next week and try to train 74 skills in 1 week to enough level with enough volume to get better at each one of them, not going to happen, right? So, but despite that, you still need to train a large variety, right? So even the foundational skills I mentioned, there was 14 of them I found. 14 is a lot already, right? But then each one of those has some variations that you can play with, either different, bars or implements. You can add in combinations of effort patterns, right? So you could have like a barbell deadlift for a maximum effort. Next week it's for a repeated effort, and next week it's a medley for a fastest effort, and the next week it's like an isometric effort where you're just doing a barbell deadlift and hold. And so there's like all these different variety of strongman skills. Now the one thing about this is it makes it very fun, right? It's challenging to master that many skills, but it makes it really fun, makes it so you probably shouldn't get too stagnant. If you do, it's going to be your own fault. It won't be because of the sport is constrained the skills that you can train, right? So anyways, all of this highlights just that you need to train a large variety of skills, and that's very important to consider when you're laying out your training and your competition schedule and so on and so forth. So that's a list of principles. Pretty simple, right? I hope so. Like, I hope you connect with these, very quickly. And obviously, there's lots of details, and we're going to go through those in a second. But just, keep in mind that these principles and the data that I'm using to derive them and all of the things we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, they're just guidelines, right? There's no other studies that I found in the literature to guide this answers to these questions that I laid out, those 4 fundamental questions. And so, and I've just produced some studies, and the studies could be garbage, right? It's like you could not agree with the results, the choices they made, all these things. No one's replicated the studies, but you know, at least there's something to go off of, right? But just keep that in mind. I'm giving you general advice here, general recommendations that are based on these studies in my experience. But again, they're just guidelines. You have to take them, there's no substitute for individualization, right? So, whatever your goals are, your scenario, your body, your strengths, your weaknesses, that all has to be factored in here. What I'm talking about will give you a good starting point, right? So instead of you starting like I did with absolutely no knowledge, just kind of like throwing darts at the wall and seeing if any stick, you don't have to start there. You can start, with in a much better spot if you take some of the advice I'm going to give to you. And if you don't want to take it, no problem. That's fine. That's for you to decide. So now, I want to just basically take all those principles and break them down. So, I'm going to give you some examples, give you my recommendations, any practical considerations, and yeah, hopefully, I'll basically take those arguments I propose now and give you a bunch more insights about them. So, let's dive into it. All right, let's start with principle one. So, again, competing basically comes at the cost of training time, right? So there's like a balance, right? And if you take, put more contests into your schedule, then there's less time in between each contest to train, let alone recover, eat, do all that stuff, right? That I was just, you just take the training and competing, I hope that's a pretty easy concept to understand for you. So now, that's the base level, training versus competing. But assume training you're doing well. Imagine you're working submaximally, you're going near to failure on things that are not very likely to hurt you. You're making sure you're recovering on time and doing everything, that's responsible in that way. Let's assume for a second training's like well covered. Now, you can add more contests in, but the point I want to make here is it's not just the time of the contest. It's not even just the time of peaking for that contest that takes away from training. There's other things to consider. There's kind of four, areas here that you have to consider. So every competition requires extra time to prepare the specific skills. So that's what I was talking about, peaking phase, right? Right before the contest, you're focusing on those skills, very high intensity, getting, your tactics and everything down. That's number one. Number two is recovering after the preparation phase and before the contest. We often call that a taper or a tapering phase. And that's, often 1 to 2 weeks of time, maybe longer, depends what situation you're in. The third one is recovering after the contest. So, you do the contest, that's only one day, let's say. Maybe for pros, it's two. World's Strongest Man and stuff, it's multiple days. Okay. But then there's the recovery from the contest. And if you really pushed yourself, that recovery can be quite a while. Um, and then the last one is imagine you get recovered and you want to start training for the next contest, there's an adaptation period. So basically, and I've always found this myself, if you change your training program drastically, which you often have to do for strongman, especially in the in season, it's a new contest. Like I said, no two contests are the same. So you have to have maybe a whole new set of skills, right? Or at least variations that is takes time for your body to adapt to. So even if you're recovered, I often find week one of that first cycle feels like shit, and so you might have to do that week one over a few times so things start to feel good. But anyways, that's the adaptation phase to your new training program for whatever your next goals are. So those are the four things that come along with each contest. So if you're an amateur, it's not just a one day of competing, right? It's not just like, oh, I just added one day this weekend and one day in 3 weeks and one day and 3 months after that. That's my three contests. It's like you have weeks of all this other stuff to consider in there. That's highly variable. Things are changing. You add the uncertainty element into it, like you don't know the events and stuff, and now you have program changes in between. So there's a lot to consider by adding more contests into your schedule. And I hope all of that highlights that all of that I just said is not training time. And training time is the time that you use to get more proficient and get stronger. So you see that deciding to do a contest or deciding on contests frequently comes at this huge cost of training time. So you have to, make intelligent decisions. How much stronger do I want to get in this period versus, maybe I want to compete more in this period and not worry so much about getting stronger. I will focus on other aspects of my performance. So that's kind of what comes along with this principle and that I want you to think about. So now, with that said, there's obviously a spectrum of competition frequency, right? So or I'll talk about here the most, but the least you could compete is one time, right? One time, let's say per year, once per year, to be a strongman competitor, right? And then the most you could compete, well, in theory, it's every weekend probably. But I mentioned this in one of the earlier episodes, looking at the data in chapter 5. And in the last episode, I mentioned that when looking at professional athletes, one athlete actually in the data set I looked at, which was from 2012 to 2023 World's Strongest Man and Arnold Strongman Classic, one athlete competed 19 times in a year, and that was the highest I found in the data set. Now that athlete was Krzysztof Radzikovsky, and so if you took 19 times per year, you're looking at, and this is spaced equally, 2.7 weeks between contests. Now, in my experience, as a natural athlete, I need at least a week to recover, and I mean a week of like not not really training at all, right? Walking around, lots of hydration, extra massages, and other medical, professionals working with me. Sometimes even longer, right? Now, maybe you could speed that up with performance enhancing drugs and maybe lots of money spent on your body and stuff like that. But so you have 2.7 weeks between contests. You need a week to recover. So let's say give you 1.5 weeks to train. And so, how much stronger are you going to get in 1.5 weeks would only be a few training sessions. And like I said, each contest is new skills. So maybe it's a completely new training program for that 1.5 weeks. And so I really think that at that kind of frequency, you're basically at a maintenance mode for your whole year, if they were evenly spaced out like that. And honestly, this kind of frequency is potentially why we didn't see Mr. Radzikovsky stay longer in the sport. I could imagine, especially, he probably didn't do this as an amateur, but once he got to a strength base where he could just maintain the strength and compete more often, that's probably how it worked out for him. But, the risk of injuries there, as I mentioned in episode 7, last episode, there was 80, when they surveyed power lifters, I think it was Winwood et al., surveyed surveyed strongmen, and they reported that 82% of them had suffered injuries, right? And so if you competed 19 times per year, you could imagine it could be a lot of injuries that year, right? But if you're competing this frequently, my kind of takeaway here is treat it as like a maintenance phase, just a big long maintenance phase. Or honestly, just recovering in contests, and then the contests are your training essentially, right? Every 2.7 weeks, you got another one, and you're kind of just like recovering and maybe focusing on your technique, your proficiency with the different implements, and not really going too heavy in between, because I mean, really, you can't afford to when you're competing that frequently. So, essentially, this kind of contest frequency I would not recommend, because it's basically no time to get stronger. So maybe if you're at the end of your career, you just want to go out in a blaze of glory, enjoy all the contests that you can muster. Yeah, maybe do this, but you'll have to be smart about it. So now let's look at the other end of the spectrum. So I tend to want to think absolute beginner here, right? Who's going to pick one contest per year. Honestly, it could be anybody. It could be an advanced athlete too. But let's just take the absolute beginner, because I think that one's like an easy one to understand and highlight the ideas here. So if I was an absolute beginner, I would pick one show in it. I'd give myself enough, like a 12-month period, let's say. Now, one thing why that it's important is because all things equal, the longer time you have to prepare, the more likely you're going to achieve your goals. So you'll actually have a higher probability of setting yourself up for success. Obviously, there's a caveat there. If you start having success and then you set some goals for your contest that's 12 months away, and you already achieve some numbers that are more than them, now you're going to increase it, right? And it just keeps spiraling. But let's pretend that's not the case, to simplify it. Now, the other thing I mentioned why picking such a long time period or such a low contest frequency at the start is good is because beginners have a whole bunch of skills to practice, as I mentioned a few times already, right? Lots of varieties, lots of different implements. And it's, way more complicated than, say, something like powerlifting. So, um, let me take you through kind of a general template here I might follow if I was an absolute beginner or more towards that side of my career. And I was going to pick a contest frequency of once per year. So I'm going to pick a contest and basically work back 8 to 12 months or so. So let's look at an example now. So here you can see, I've assumed, let's say we have 8 months to prepare. More time, the better, as I mentioned, but let's go on the lower end here of 8 months. So basically, I've split this into three phases roughly. One would be spend the first 3 months just doing general preparation. Now, if you're an absolute beginner, maybe you lifted in some other fashion, maybe you didn't, which I would suggest you should have even more preparation time. But let's just assume that you have some kind of experience. Spend 3 months just doing general preparation, right? So, learning the proper technique and safety considerations for each of the skills. I mean, you could take the foundational skills that I laid out, in chapter 2, and just start with those, right? That's already 14 skills. But go find people who do this like myself and learn proper technique, learn safety considerations, learn how to fail a squat and not kill yourself, learn how to fail a log press and not drop it on your face, or crush yourself with it, right? Get into the routine of regular training. So, especially if you haven't lifted much or haven't lifted for a while, there's so much value in just building the discipline of having regular training, right? So 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever your weekly training frequency is, doesn't matter. But get into the routine. Don't miss sessions, right? Don't make excuses. That's part of general preparation, right? Because if you don't have that, then when you go into specific preparation and contest prep, when things get heavy and hard, it's going to be, you won't have the discipline built up to keep doing the work you need to do at that point, right? So in this phase, just focus on getting proficient with heavy work, but that's more general, right? So just compound barbell movements, squats, deadlifts, bench press, overhead press, power cleans, snatches, that kind of stuff. All kinds of stuff you can do with dumbbells or machines, things like that. High focus on accessory work and building your muscles, right? So lots of hypertrophy focus work there. And then lighter technical stuff, right? So if you have someone in your area or you purchase equipment or something like a log or whatever, start light, focus on the technique, right? Video yourself, have people watch you, whatever, get the feedback. But that's basically how I would spend the first 3 months in a general preparation. And basically, you're building confidence and discipline, right? Okay. The next 3 months, I would focus on learning how to strain, because essentially what a contest is straining on all the events to your maximum capabilities so that you can hopefully strain more with heavier weight than the other people did and win, or whatever your goal is, achieve some weight, some placing, whatever. But that next 3 months is basically that kind of traditional strength focused work, right? So you're ramping up the workloads with strongman skills. If you have strongman equipment or people around you, you can use it. You're going to start to throw more of that in. and basically build your work capacity, right? So here's where we go back to the principle of training multiple strongman skills in some sessions, right? So hopefully you start to throw these in here in this kind of 3 month phase. And then the last two phase will be focused on preparing specifically for that contest. So hopefully most of the time 2 months out, sometimes not. World's Strongest Man always comes to mind in this. You don't know the events, but usually 8 weeks out, promoters are pretty good. The events are pretty solid, and you're aware of what they will be, right? So you can actually just for those 2 months only train those events, right? Because you want your technical mastery, any tactics, um, and the specific strength to develop on those specific skills that you'll be tested on. And then obviously, this is like any kind of peaking phase where slowly the volume has to get less and the intensity has to get up more and more and more, and focus on the technical proficiency to minimize injury risk and optimize performance. So that's basically, if I was an absolute beginner, a general recommendation for how I would start. Pick one contest per year and then split it up into those kind of training phases. And I'm leaving out a lot of details here. Of course, if you have questions, get a hold of me. But that's the general recommendation. All right. So now, like I said, imagine this beginner won't have access to equipment. I wouldn't even worry about that part. That's how everyone starts. Almost everyone. There might be some privileged people these days that the first gym they go to is the mecca of strongman and it has everything. It has, you know, old, washed up strongman, or maybe if you're lucky, current, top level strongman. They can show you exactly what to do and everything like that. Most people don't start there. I didn't start there. I live in a small town where there was gyms that didn't want you to drop weights on mats or use chalk or grunt or anything. I don't know how many of the gyms I got kicked out of just for trying to train hard, right? That's more, I think, what people's experience is. But that's okay because, I mean, I and a lot of other people I know are a testament that it doesn't matter. It's about the mindset, it's about the discipline, and it's about doing what you can control. So if all you have access to barbells, dumbbells, power racks, just basic standard strength equipment, you can get super strong. It wasn't that long ago when that's all the equipment that anyone ever had, right? So that's how I started. I think I trained the first few years of my career without touching any of the implements until I went to a contest, right? So it's possible. Now, it's not the best way to start, but don't let it stop you, right? If you want to do this, get after it. And if you're not sure about specifics, like I said, get a hold of me. Happy to help. So, on top of that, because I've been through this myself, like I said, I trained many years with only basically barbells and trying to be a barbell strongman. I wrote a program specifically for someone like you, someone like I used to be, or the situation I used to be in. Basically, a 30-day free training program where all you need is barbells, a bench, a power rack, and you can get super strong and up to and including preparing for strongman competition. That program is called Strong Foundations. It's over on the Strength Intelligence website, strengthintelligence.ca. It's up there for free, so go ahead and pick up a copy, and hopefully that'll help you get started if you're one of the people like I'm talking about now. So now we've discussed professionals or that very high frequency, beginners that starting competition frequency. Let's discuss somewhere in the middle, right? So maybe you've trained for a bit and you're like maybe you're still newer, maybe you're intermediate, maybe you're advanced but you're not a pro, things like that. I want to give you my general recommendation that I think would fall in line for those kind of people who are want to pursue strongman training and competing for a long time period. So not the beginner who's just dipping their foot in, but where this is their people like yourselves are committed to a multi-year journey. So given the data that I came out with here in Foundations of Strongman Training and my personal experience, I would recommend that training 3 times per year is a great kind of starting point and balance for most people, especially for amateurs. So if you train 3 contests per year and they were evenly spaced, you'd have 17 weeks of training in between each one of those contests. Now, with 17 weeks, that's more than enough time to do all the stuff I mentioned that comes along with competing and also still have time to get stronger. I think in the book, I even laid out several studies where they showed strength gains. Now, mind you, not for strongman. This was more general strength training, maybe powerlifting, where people got a good amount stronger in only 8 weeks of training. Here we have 17 weeks of training, so more than double the time. So I hope that kind of shows you that there's more than enough time for you to get, stronger, maybe not as strong as you want to be in those 8 or 16 weeks, but stronger, right? So you have training time. So that's one reason why I think 3 contests per year is a great idea. 3 contests per year is also typically the minimum you need in any countries or regions where they have a 3-tiered structure. So let me give you Canada, for example. Strongman Corporation Canada, that's our non-drug tested nationwide federation. They basically have a 3-tiered hierarchy where you have to compete at a regional level show and qualify. So make a certain position, right, for second, third, something like that. You qualify for provincials, or if you're in the US somewhere else, it's like a state, right, your province. You do your provincial kind of championship, and if you place high enough in that, you get an invite to nationals. And then obviously, if that's a lot of people's goals, is to be the best in their nation and their weight class, gender, whatever. And so, but that's the right there, that's 3 contests. That's the minimum you would need to be able to do in order to have a shot at, competing for a national title. So that's another reason why I think that competing 3 times per year makes sense for, that person who's looking to do this long term, who probably has those kind of aspirations, right? And then the last reason here is that competing 3 times per year actually aligns with the data I found in the book regarding professional athletes. So in chapter 5 of the book, in that study, I found that most strongmen from either World Strongest Man Finals or Arnold Strongman Classic, so the best in the world, they compete on average 6 times per year, plus or minus 3. So that means that most of them compete between 3 and 9 times per year. And I looked across, 13 years of data or whatever from these athletes. And so if you want to place top 10 in those shows, that's how often those are competing. So 3 times per year is at the bottom end of that. So it actually aligns with, what the professionals are doing on like an average, right? Average plus or minus a standard deviation. So I think that seems appropriate to be at that lower end of what the professionals do because, if you're like me, most people aren't professional strongmen. They have other things going on in their lives. And so 3 contests a year is already a lot to factor in there with the training and stuff. And then obviously you have everything else going on. Professional athletes, they're professional because, basically their life is dedicated to this. So they shut out the noise or do other things there and focus more on competing, which is why they compete on average 6 times per year. So if you're competing 3 times per year, why I'm making this comparison here is because it's at the lower end of what the pros would do, which means that I think it still keeps your foot in the door for preparing you if you are moving on to that professional level of strongman, right? So if you're used to 3 times a year, then maybe when you move up, you can do 3 international shows per year. And then if things go well, make some money, whatever, sponsors and stuff, maybe that'll afford you the ability to move up and compete that 6 or 9 times per year, right? So that's the last reason why I recommend this. So with that in mind, 3 times per year, 17 weeks in between contests. Let me take you through another example where I break down more specifically how I would lay out different phases of this training across those 17 weeks. Okay, so here you can see the phasic structure I've outlined here. Let's go through it quickly. Weeks 1 and 2, I'm just assuming we're coming off of a contest that was evenly spaced, like I said. We're just going to recover from the last contest. For me, I would recommend just very light training, probably mostly just a lot of walking or other cardio activity. Light training, body weight stuff. Maybe near the end of the second week, you can start moving some implements for light weights, but basically no heavy training at all, right? Just really put all of your efforts into recovering. Sleep more, have some naps, extra massages, whatever. Okay, so now we get into the first kind of block here, weeks 3 to 7. This should be a 4-week training cycle, but I think, as I mentioned before, sometimes it helps to repeat week 1, especially if your training program compared to the last training phase you started is very different. But basically, here we're focused on general preparation, right? So we're building work capacity, basically getting into shape for the phases that will follow, right? Target your weaknesses here in this phase, right? So if you came off the contest and either you had an injury or you noticed, let's say, like you had, if your hip flexors were just 10% stronger, you would have been able to, lift that sandbag, that many more inches or that many more reps, maybe hit that in this kind of phase, right? So just generally preparing your body and discipline to support what's to come. All right, weeks 8 to 11. This is going to be a strength and power phase with a focus on strongman skills. Oftentimes, you might not know what the contest skills are at this point. That's okay. You can use the data and tables and stuff I laid out in Foundations of Strongman Training in order to prioritize what you're going to train. But basically, train a lot of variety of skills because you don't know what's going to happen. If you know the contest skills in this phase, I would actually train variants of them. Uh, so, for example, if you know you're going to have a barbell deadlift coming up, I would just train variants of that. You can train at different heights. You can add bands, right? You can do a medley with it, a week or two here or there, whatever you want. Basically, it's all going to prepare you not just for this contest, but you have other contests coming up as well, right? But if you know the events, I would say in this phase, choose some variants of them, right? And maybe throw the contest skills in like once in these 4 weeks. Maybe at the end of the 4 weeks, you kind of test in a sense with some submaximal weights. In this phase, though, avoid working to failure with 1 rep maxes. Okay, the name of the game here is building strength and power and work capacity. The 1 rep maxes or those um, really brutal AMRAPs, things like that, save those, right? As we approach contest. Here we're just like building strength, building confidence, building power and speed. Okay. Now, next, weeks 12 to 15, this would be the kind of traditional peaking block. I hope by now you would know what the events are at this point. By the end of this 4-week phase, I would generally, and again, general recommendations here, you'd be targeting something like testing your abilities with, like, if you have a static event like a deadlift, a log press, something like that, maybe performing like a 2 repetition maximum by the end of this peaking block, something like that. So it's hard enough, but it's not like this absolute ball buster failure, because that's actually what you're going to want to say for the contest. And if it's moving events, they're getting progressively heavier and shorter, right? So by the end, say week 14, you have a yoke walk to do. Maybe you're doing like 90% of contest weight. Let's just give an example here. Imagine your contest weight was 700 pounds for 100 feet. Maybe you do like 600 pounds for like 50 feet, right? So half the distance, but you do 2, 3 runs of those, right? So it's getting heavy and shorter as you go. Because if that, what I said, the 700 pounds for 100 feet is your absolute max, you don't want to, blow your load here 3 weeks before the contest. Let's get heavy enough and hard enough, and then pull back all the fatigue out of your system, and then on contest day you can actually go for it. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here with this peaking block. The last 2 weeks, 16 and 17, that's going to be a traditional 2 week taper. So week one is you're still performing the contest movements, but at drastically reduced workloads, and not just workloads, intensities as well, right? So for me in my 2 week taper, week one, I might be, depending on how I feel, right? If I feel really good, maybe in my first session, I might touch like 65%, 70% of the, one repetition max of, for say, for a static lift, like a deadlift or a squat, right? And then every session after that, the weight is dropping drastically, right? By the end of week one, maybe I'm touching like 30%, right? I'm basically just going through the motions with weight that should seem super easy. And I'm doing this for like, a single set a couple times that week. Just to like keep the motion pattern, just to keep feeling like I'm doing something. There's a lot of mental aspects on this, but allowing all the fatigue or as much of it as possible to dissipate from your body. Week 17, that second week of the taper, is basically for me complete cessation of specific training. If you want to go in, your back feels kind of jacked up from a weird night's sleep or something, and or you're feeling anxious, that happens a lot about a certain lift. Yeah, go in the gym and like do a 20% 1 rep max set of deadlifts. Just go through it, make your brain, take the anxiety out of you, right? You want to calm down mentally, you want to dissipate fatigue physically. So, extra sleeping, walking, extra fueling, assuming you're not weight cutting and all that stuff. That's the week 17. So, I know that was a lot, but that completes my kind of general recommendation for people who are on this multi-year strongman journey. This is, if you had it 17 weeks to train, evenly spaced out, this is just like a general prescription, a general guideline of how I would think about training. Again, please individualize it. And if you need help with that, I'm happy to help you. All right, let's move on to principle number 2. Okay, principle number 2, and that was that you can use training parameter generalizations like motion pattern classes and effort pattern classes to combat the strongman uncertainty problem. So, defining the competition schedule helps to shape the training. However, it's the actual details of that contest that have a huge effect on what's actually going into your training program. So, for example, we could have first 2 people training for the same contest could have very different looking training programs if one of them knows the skills and the other one doesn't, right? So in Foundations of Strongman Training, I outlined those I outlined 2 training parameter generalizations: motion pattern classes and effort pattern classes. Let me just define them here in case you didn't get to watch those episodes. A motion pattern class is basically defines the set of positions. Sorry, let me step back. A motion pattern defines a set of positions for a skill. So a skill is a combination of motion pattern and effort pattern. The motion pattern defines the positions that the person or the objects need to move between, right? You need to pick up this yoke and move it from this point to that point. The effort pattern defines the forces or how you're going to get it there, or what the way that you should move between the points. For example, you might have a maximum effort pattern class. A maximum effort is where we're going to take a single repetition and lift the heaviest weight. You might have a repeated effort where you're going to take a single weight and move it for the most amount of repetitions. So those are examples of motion pattern classes, right? So we could have like uh, I mentioned a carry earlier. That carry is the motion pattern class, and it has motion patterns in it, which would be like a farmer's walk, a yoke walk, a sandbag carry. Those are the motion patterns. And then if you pair those motion patterns with effort patterns, you get skills, right? Which would be the most specific thing that you will actually be tested on. So in the book, those are 2 training parameter generalizations that you can use to overcome uncertainty. Now, to highlight this, I thought it would be best, again, to talk you through some examples First, when contest skills are known, and we can look at that. That's a bit of the easier case, I would say. And then secondly, when the contest skills are unknown, and that's where, the either your experience or the kind of data and stuff I lay out on Foundations of Strongman Training will really help. So let's look at one example from each of those scenarios. So first, considered a seasoned athlete. That's an important part in one of these two scenarios. So the first one I want to go through is that this seasoned athlete is actually in season. And so just like any other sport, we talk about our training phases as an in season block and an off season or out of season, right? So the seasoned athlete is in the in season, and they're between contests, and they know the upcoming skills at the next contest. Okay. The second scenario will be that you have the seasoned athlete, and they're transitioning from the off season to the in season, but they don't know the details of that upcoming skill. And that's going to be very common for most of you who are in this sport in perpetuity. So now for these examples, I'm going to assume that both athletes have 12 weeks to prepare for that upcoming contest. Okay, so that's kind of the framework we're going to work with. So let's go through the first example. Again, this is where we have an athlete and they're in season, and in between contests, the contest details are known, right? So in this scenario here, you can see the timeline that I've kind of laid out here. Remember, there's 12 weeks total. So the athlete is just coming off of a contest. They need 2 weeks to recover and adapt, let's assume, right? Like I kind of mentioned when talking about the last principle. And they'll also need 2 weeks to taper before the contest, basically, recover, dissipate fatigue. So if you take that out of our 12-week total, that leaves you with 8 weeks dedicated to training. Now, I just want to emphasize this here. I said in this scenario that the skills are known. Now, if you know the skills of your contest, train them. There's nothing worse than failing an event at a contest or getting second place or something because you didn't spend that 3 extra sessions training the specific event that you're going to be tested on because for whatever reason you thought that it was better to do something else, right? I've been there before, and it's just stupid if you ask me. If you know the skills, train them. Okay. Now, in this example, you have 8 weeks dedicated to training. What I would do is I would split these into 2 4-week blocks. Okay. So in the first block, similar to what I've discussed before, higher workloads, focusing on technique, maybe tactics, throwing in some strongman implements, but maybe some more variations. And then the second block would be basically you're going to have to use that as your competition peaking phase, right? So focus on the skills in this example, we know the skills 12 weeks out. So in both blocks, you can tailor them to those skills. In the second block here, basically you're training only those skills. You're ramping up intensity, reducing the volume slowly. So as you can see, this example is pretty straightforward. And it's kind of like the ideal scenario, right? Nothing has changed. You have 12 weeks. You know the details before. And so in this scenario, we don't actually have much uncertainty, right? So we don't need to use training parameter generalizations. And so that's why I wanted to go through this example first. So now let's look at the second example here. So again, you'll see another timeline where I've kind of highlighted the different portions of it here. But again, just to recap, this is the scenario where we have a seasoned athlete. They're coming off their off season. They have a contest in 12 weeks and they don't know the details. And we can assume they won't know the details till much closer to the contest. Okay. So this is where this, training parameter generalizations can help. So let's assume that the event details will be known 6 weeks out. So they have 12 weeks. The first half, they don't know the details of the contest, but the second half, the second 6 weeks, they will know the details. Okay. So now a couple things to consider. Because they're coming from the off season, let's assume that there's no need for a 2-week recovery to start the 12 weeks. Right before the athlete in scenario 1 was in between contests, which means he we assumed he or she just came out of a contest, so they need recovery time. Let's assume that this athlete has done really well in their off season and they're really prepared and they don't carry a ton of fatigue. They can just step right in, so they don't need 2 weeks to recover. Okay, so we don't need these 2 weeks at the start of the 12 weeks, but they still have the taper at the end, right? That doesn't go away. So basically, they have 10 weeks of dedicated training. 6 training weeks from the start will be with unknown skills, and then 4 weeks later on you will know the skills of the contest. Okay, so in this scenario, I would basically take the first 6 weeks and split them into 2 3-week mesocycles. Okay, each mesocycle will focus on a different set of strongman skills. Let's say, remember I told you on average they test 5 skills per contest. So let's say each one of these mesocycles, you pick 5 different strongman skills, and you're going to basically pick 5 the first mesocycle and 5 new ones the second mesocycle. Now, why is this? It's because you don't know what the skills are at the contest yet. So, in order to be as generally prepared as possible, you're going to train different sets of skills. Now, there's lots of complications in here where you can make things overlap or target weaknesses, right? We're not really going to get into individualization here, but that's how I would take it. Now, where the training parameter generalizations come in here is because you can use those to basically prioritize those skills, right? So if you know that you should be training, so let me give you examples here. Let's say in the first 3 weeks, you're going to train axle deadlift, yoke walk, sandbag toss, log press, and sandbag load. And each of those falls into a certain motion pattern class, right? So axle deadlift is deadlift, yoke walk is a carry event, sandbag toss is a throw event, log press is a press event, and sandbag load is a load event. You could go into Foundations of Strongman Training and look at the proportions of each of those motion pattern classes to dictate how much time in that first cycle will be spent on each of those 5 skills. So as I mentioned, carrying was the motion pattern class that had the highest percentage of all the skills tested. So in this case, then let's say 25%, like I mentioned before, should be spent on yoke walking. If we're not accounting for your individual weaknesses here. And then pressing was next, so maybe we should spend the most amount of time on pressing, and then it was deadlift, then load, and so on. Now we can do the same. Now cycle 2, let's pick 5 new skills like axle squat, farmer's walk, tire flip, arm over arm sled pull, and Atlas stone load, for example. And we can do the same thing. In this case, let's talk about the effort pattern classes. So we can go through these and just kind of guess about what we might expect at the contest or what we might need to prepare our body. So we could just say, for example, that farmer's walk will be a fastest effort, and it most likely will in most contests. Fastest efforts were made up 55% of all skills tested in the one study that I shared. So we could start at least with our baseline that 55% of the work done in the cycle 2 will be fastest efforts. And they don't all have to be on the farmer's walk, right? We could do an axle squat for fastest effort as well. Or we could do a tire flip for repeated efforts and basically use the proportions of effort pattern classes, the other training parameter generalization, to prioritize the effort patterns. And these 2 cycles, I only chose to talk about motion pattern classes and effort pattern classes, but you can actually use both of those on both cycles. Okay. And you can basically use that as a way to prioritize or a baseline. Then you can individualize from there. So that's what I would do with the first 2 weeks when things are unknown. And that's kind of what I think the power of the analyses that I did with motion pattern classes and effort pattern classes provides, is these scenarios where you don't know what's coming up at all, but you still have to do something that's intelligent and hopefully helps you have the best performance. Okay. And then now, if we are into the second half of this 12 weeks, the last 6 weeks, well, I said we assume that this is when we learn the skills. So that last 4 week block, we know exactly the skills. That would be our traditional peaking phase. And so we're just going to train the skills, right? If you know the skills, train them. We're going to train them heavy. We're going to train them hard, and we're going to, maybe sprinkle in some tactical and technical work where needed. And then we have that last 2 weeks where it's the taper, right? So I hope that this highlights, you know, how you can use training parameter generalizations to fill in those gaps when you do not know the skills or there's some other uncertainty in your way, right? Like, for example, maybe you want to compete at a certain time of year, but none of the contests have been announced around there. And it might be some weeks before and some weeks after whatever proposed date. I've been in that scenario before. You can use those training parameter generalizations to still build a wonderful foundation and get you generally prepared. And then whenever you're able to pick a contest specifically and know the events, then you can, like I said, if you know the events, train them and kind of move into it that way. So now we went through only two examples here, but obviously each athlete and their contest goals and schedules are different. So, and you add in uncertainty to that, all I want you to really take away from this is that there's these tools I laid out and you can use them to help you to overcome uncertainty to some degree, but that you're going to have to make the effort for that, and it's going to have to be done dynamically. This is where working with a coach, is really helpful. And so, if you're unsure about how to apply these, techniques or analyses, get a hold of me. I'm happy to go a bit deeper on them with you. So, yeah. Okay. That was a lot, but I hope that highlights that second principle for you. Let's move on to the third one. Okay. Principle 3: train multiple strongman skills during training sessions. And now I want to emphasize what I said before. Please, for the love of God, don't train multiple strongman skills every session. I mean, it sounds good. Oh, we're tested on 5 skills per session or per contest, so I better train every session like that. Look, I've done this and I've seen others do it. At minimum, you're going to burn out, you'll be unable to recover, and then you just won't be able to achieve your goals because you won't be able to keep up with the training demand. Worst case, you're going to actually get injured in training. And you know what? You tear your bicep off trying to load that final stone in the Atlas Stone Run series at your contest to take the win. Yeah, good for you, right? That's like respectable. You tear your bicep off in a deadlift warm up on the 6th skill of your multi-skill training day that you've done for multiple weeks on end. You're an idiot, right? So, but all the power to you. Try it out if you want. But I'm just telling you, I've done it, and I've been the idiot, and it's only led me to injury essentially. So I don't want that to happen to you. I want you to have less injuries and meet your goals, right? So, take it for what it is. But I would suggest that don't train multiple strongman skills, especially to really hard or high levels every session. It's going to kill you. What I would recommend instead is start with 1 session per week where you train multiple strongman skills and see how it goes. And even with that, start very light, right? Why I recommend this is because when I started going and training with other athletes and professional athletes, this is what they did, right? Most people have jobs and things like that going on. So during the week, they have time to train 1 or 2 strongman skills per week. And then they have a lot of time, more time at least on the weekends. And so they have a strongman Saturday or strongman Sunday where they train multiple events. And that keeps them primed for contests because contests are typically on Saturdays or Sundays, right? So, anyways, little hint there about how the pros do it. Now, Let's assume that you do want to have multiple sessions with multiple skills every week. Let me take you through a couple of examples to highlight some things to consider. So let's consider an athlete that trains 4 times per week, so 4 training sessions every week, and they're trying to decide, should they have one strongman skill every session, or should they have 3 strongman skills every session? Now, let me show you some example programs here that kind of highlight this. So, here in this first scenario, this is with the one strongman skill per session. In these sessions, the strongman skill is prioritized as the main exercise because, obviously those are the things you're going to get tested on. So, they're the thing, and they're going to be the heaviest absolute load exercises that you want to do. You want to do at the start of your session when you have the most energy, right? So that's why those are there. And then you see there's subsequent exercises that build the main skill or address some movement or muscle specific weaknesses, right? So let's just take this example across 4 weeks of training like this, then you would touch each of those main skills 4 times, right? And for a total of 16 times. And you'd likely make some decent progress on each one of those skills given that time point, and given that there's other exercises that are targeting non-specific weaknesses. Okay, so that's what it would maybe look like with one strongman skill per session. Now let's look at the other the other end that the person was looking at, 3 skills per session. Now, if each, you see here, there is only strongman skill slotted in here, no other non-specific exercises. Now, if each of these is trained hard enough, you won't have energy left for secondary or accessory or builder exercises, whatever you want to call them, non-specific exercises, general exercises, because strongman training is so draining, and it's typically all full body fatigue, right? So that's why there's only 3 of these. Look, I've done this before, and why I'm laying this out is because this is where you will get to. You'll start with this happy vision of, oh, I'll just train 3 strongman skills per session every session, and then instead of like 4 accessory exercises, I'll just do 2, right? And that should work. It's only 5 exercises, and you're filled with optimism, right? Sounds great. And then you start doing it, and then all of a sudden you find yourself exactly like what I'm showing you here, where you're having trouble just getting through the 3 strongman skills at sufficient workloads 4 times a week, right? So it sounds great to do this, but eventually you end up here. Really, I found that even with this, where you just have the 3 skills per session 4 times a week, it never works as expected. It hasn't for me. I don't know others who have had success, because I don't think you can train these 3 skills, or each 3 skills on each session, with sufficient workload to make progress and not have your recovery affect your next session, right? So you're basically unable to recover for the next session. So basically, this never works because, firstly, that third skill that you train each session will never be as effective as the first skill because you'll be fatigued. If you train skill 1 and skill 2 in this scenario super hard, like you need to get better and to build strength, that third one is going to be very hard for you to push through. And on the days when you go in there and you don't want to be there, it's going to be hell. I don't know how many times I've given up on exercise number 3 in a scenario like this just because I didn't have the energy to, give it its due, right? Secondly, this isn't going to work because, why does this point number 1 happen? Because strongman skills, almost all of them require a full body movement, right? It's not like where you can sit down and do a preacher curl and it's like isolated on your arms and specifically on your biceps. It's like every skill you do is taxing your whole body. And so the fatigue just compounds. And that's why, I said point number 1. Lastly, why I think this might fail if done for a long time is because there's no exercises that directly target movement or muscle weaknesses, right? So you'll target any specific weaknesses you have with those skills, and that's good because they're ultimately what you're going to get tested on, right? But there's reasons why that becomes too brutal over time, and it's actually beneficial to step back from that and address weaknesses in a more general sense, right? That's why we have phases of training. So, in general, in the scenario here with the 3 skills per session, I do not recommend this. Now, there might be times where this is necessary, like you have a tight time window between contests and you're not going to do this for like weeks and months. But I would take that case by case. In general, I would not structure strongman training like this, especially if you're earlier in your career. So, how would I structure training to address this principle? Um, Let me give you my general recommendation here. If we look at a microcycle, so we can consider that 1 week of training. Unless you have insane recovery or all you do is athletics, so maybe you're a pro strongman, you likely can only train 3 or 4 hard sessions per week. I'm saying this from experience. I went from training 6 to 7 days a week, and I whittled that down now. Now I'm in my 13th season, and I train 3 days per week, and that is all because of recovery. So with those 3 sessions, I can maintain. I can work hard in each one, and I can recover for the next one and not have it affect the next training, at least generally, right? And that's going to be the same for anyone who's been doing this a while. When you're earlier on, you're younger, either in training age or absolute age, you can maybe get away with more. And part of that is because you haven't learned how to strain hard enough to induce the amount of fatigue that I'm talking about, right? But once you get out of that beginner phase, I think you're looking at, I would actually set training up with a 3 or 4 day week, because those 3 or 4 days are going to be really hard. They're going to be more than taxing enough to make you strong and proficient at whatever skills you want to perform well, right? So now, my recommendation is to train 1 session per week with multiple strongman skills. Okay, so like I said, the principle here is train sessions with multiple skills. I think 1 a week is a pretty good balance, and if anything, I would go less than 1 per week, so 1 every 2 weeks if you're finding it too much. But let's stick on this train with one strongman skill, one multi strongman skill session per week. Then the rest of your sessions, whether you do 3 days or 4 days per week, have a single strongman skill as the main exercise. And that way, each of them you can still build those skills with builder skills or accessory skills, or work on your general weaknesses that pertain to whatever skill you're trying to move on. So, with that kind of structure in mind, let me show you what a week might look like, or kind of a template you can use for either a 3 day week, 3 training sessions per week, or 4 training sessions per week. So, first, let's look at 3 training sessions per week. For the 3 sessions per week, I would use, and this is in terms of strongman skills, a 1-1-4 format. So, you're basically training 6 total strongman skills per week, which, go do this for a while. You'll find out that that's more than enough once you're able to strain hard and train enough workload. So that's the format here. So you'll see here that I've chosen like a yoke walk and a log press for the single strongman skill days. And that's purely because here in this example, I'm thinking about the data from the book, where yoke walk and log press are 2 of the most contested skills across the sport. So they each have their own day that's just dedicated to them, and then any associated weaknesses. And then that 4 skill day, you can pick, any kind of 4 skills. If you have a contest, great, pick the 4 skills that pertain to your contest, and if you know the skills. If you don't know the skills, just you could do the same prioritization structure and pick the 4 next most probable skills to be tested on the list that I present in the book, right? But that's what this kind of week would look like. So you have 4 skills on your 1 day per week, ideally on the weekend, because doing a multi strongman skill day takes a lot of time. Even, especially if you're by yourself. If you have a crew to train with, okay, you can maybe get this done in a couple of hours, right? Because everyone's shipping in on bringing all the equipment out and putting it all away. But if you're by yourself, it's like can take quite a long time to go through, especially if you're doing multiple sets on each one of those skills. But then on the other 2 days, you just have a single skill to focus on, and then accessories. And one distinction here is those accessory movements can build those main skills on those days, or they can build the weaknesses of the skills that are on the multi-day skill, the 4 skill day, right? Okay. Now let's look at a training frequency of 4 sessions per week. So in this, I would use a template of 1-1-1-3 in terms of strongman skills. So you see here that the deadlift that I had originally on the 4 skill day is now moved to its own day. The deadlift is one of the skills that is another foundational skill, right? And so I'm just giving it its own day here to follow the format. But basically, like, same kind of rules apply. It's just that you're spreading them out over 4 days across a week instead of 3. For me, this is actually how I used to train, this kind of template for 4 days a week. But I was not able to recover well enough as I got older and I trained, my training age increased. So I moved to the format I just showed you with the 3 days per week. But this one works great if you are able to recover and you have the time in your schedule and the rest of your life to train 4 times a week. So that's that one. Now, one note in either of these cases, and I kind of mentioned this before, please be conservative on the volume you use on the multi-skill day, especially in the beginning. And even in the the 4 training days per week format, where there's only 3 skills on the multi-skill day, you'd be surprised. You take exercise 1, you're feeling good, let's say, and you do like 4 or 5 sets. Oh man, this is good. You keep ramping up the weight, feels good. Then you get to skill number 2, and all of a sudden the fatigue sets in. You're like, okay, I can get through this. I can get through 4 sets, 6 sets, whatever. You do that with heavy enough weights, you'll get to skill 3, and it's just like the example I was talking about before. You'll be like making up excuses, especially if that event is like like a medley or something, or something very hard. It'll be very hard to get through that much volume. So on that multi skill day, start low. Like, try just 1 set of each, or try 2 sets of each of those skills, but make them pretty light on the first few times you do it, right? Be conservative. There's lots of time typically to ramp up, right? So if you start early enough doing this stuff. So yeah, scale back the number of sets, see how you feel on that multi-skill day. And if you do so, you'll find what kind of works for you, such that you can have this kind of contest simulation every weekend and still have other training sessions during the week that attack, some big fundamental skills you want to do, and recover from all of it and keep that going week after week and year after year, and obviously then meeting the goals that you want with the sport. All right. So that was principle number 3. Again, there's lots of complexity I'm leaving out there, but I hope that kind of shows you how I think about it in terms of that principle of training multiple strongman skills on some training sessions. All right, 2 more to go. Principle number 4, prioritize skills that occur most often in competition. I'm guessing this one's pretty obvious. Again, when we know the skills, train them, right? And when we don't know the skills, well, let's look at historically what was most likely to occur and let's train those. And obviously, that's without considering your individual weaknesses and so on, right? But for this principle, I want to give you some examples, but I want to keep the observation point at the microcycle level or at a week's worth of training, right? And then I'll share my thoughts and recommendations. So for this one, we're actually going to look to the professionals and look to a contest that happened not too long ago, which is the World's Strongest Man Finals in 2024. I know the 2025 finals are happening soon, which is exciting. But let's focus on that last year and from last year, and then we'll look at some different examples of what a microcycle for that contest might look like. Okay, so first of all, let me just list the skills for you so that you have them here. So I'll show them here on the screen. They are yoke walk frame carry. Again, this is just from the finals. Max axle press, max keg toss, Conan's wheel, tire deadlift, and an Atlas stone series. So there's 6 events, and there are 7 skills, right? So the first one's a medley. Now, let's assume that we're following a 4 training session per week frequency, right? And let's first take a look at how would we prioritize these skills using only the data from Foundations of Strongman Training. So let's look at the first microcycle example here with the template 1, 1, 2, 3 in terms of strongman skills. Day 1, you have yoke walk. Day 2 is axle press. Day 3 is frame carry and deadlift. And day 4 is the keg toss, Conan's wheel, and Atlas stone load. Now, why set it up like this is, again, here using only the data and Foundations of Strongman Training. So first of all, carry and press motion pattern classes are the 2 most contested. So that's why the yoke walk has its own day and the axle press has its own day, right? Now, there are 3 carry skills, but the yoke walk is the one that's contested the most. So that's why it has its own day. Okay. The remaining 5 skills are split across 2 multi-skill days. Why I chose this instead of what we talked about with the last principle was because I think this more mimics the World's Strongest Man contest structure. So usually the World's Strongest Man contest is a multi-day contest where they'll do 2 or 3 skills per day. So in this microcycle example, there's 2 multi-skill days, which would be similar to what the contest would feel like, right? Now, I put the keg toss on the 3rd day simply because it's the least systematically taxing. It's still hard to throw kegs into space, basically, but the absolute weight is way less than some of these other events, right? Okay, so this is how it could be formatted, basically with the skills prioritized based purely on the data from the studies in Foundations of Strongman Training. Now let's look at another example where we're going to modify this based on some hypothetical weaknesses that the athlete may have. So let's assume that some athlete training for this contest has major weaknesses with the keg toss and the Atlas stone loading, right? So here's the adjusted microcycle example. The template is still 1, 1, 2, 3 in terms of strongman skills, but you'll see here the Atlas stone load and the keg toss were moved to their own sessions, and this is because we're individualizing, right? So this person has the biggest weaknesses with these 2 events, so giving them each their own day allows a lot of focus and energy to be put into them, and also leave time on those days to use accessory movements that build up those 2 skills specifically, right? And then from here we can still just follow the priority from Foundations of Strongman Training. So carry and press are the most contested, and then deadlift and load and so on, right? So that's why you see the multi-skill days set up as they are. And then the axle press I put in between the 2 carry events just to split it up, right? In contests, you often don't have 2 of the same motion pattern class style events in a row. So you hardly ever will have 2 carry events in a row, or 2 deadlift events in a row, or 2 loads, right? So here, that's why the axle press is in between the frame carry and the Conan's wheel carry, right? Now, keep in mind, these are just examples, right? And the distribution of the skills will change, as well as the individual scenario will cause it to change, right? So we just talked about one contest here, the World's Strongest Man Finals in 2024. I mean, look at the events this year. They're different, right? And they're going to continue to be different, right? But I hope this kind of gives you some ideas about like, here's a contest and a set of events. How might we structure a microcycle? And then based on that, or taking that baseline, how might we adjust it to individualize it for a certain athlete with specific skill weaknesses, right? So in either of those scenarios, I hope you took, away that I'm prioritizing but what is most likely to occur in contest, which is what principle number 4 is all about, right? Now, if we take this more generally, like in chapter 2, I identified 14 what I would call foundational skills. So those are the skills that I studied a 5-year period of data, hundreds of contests, and basically those skills were tested multiple times every year in that 5-year period. So for me, those are good candidates to be called foundational skills. Means like I think also those 14 skills accounted for 70% of all skills tested. So, I mean, that's a pretty good bang for your buck, right? If you only train those 14, you'd be good to go on 70% of any of the skills you would have saw came up in that 5-year period. So, if you had no idea what skills to train and you're trying to prioritize, I would start with those at the top of the list, right? And there's variants and everything you can throw in there, but that's, kind of where I would start. So now let me kind of show you that what those skills are. Okay, so let me just read these off for you. Log press, farmer's walk, yoke walk, vehicle deadlift, circus dumbbell press, Atlas stone load, axle press, tire flip, vehicle pull, axle deadlift, barbell deadlift, frame carry, keg toss, and field stone load. So those are the 14 foundational skills that I, identified in chapter 2. Like I said, they were tested multiple times every year in the 5-year period. However, 14 skills is too much to train in just 1 week. So I would suggest you could break these up into groups. For example, I'll just give you 3. I would break them into 3 groups, basically 3 microcycles, right? So 3 different weeks. You could train these skills across and just cycle them. And there's a lot of complexity to get into, but in general, you'd probably have a pretty good, well-rounded base of strength if you did something like this. So maybe the first group I would put log press, farmer's walk, vehicle deadlift, vehicle pull, and Atlas stone load for week 1. The second group, week 2, yoke walk, circus dumbbell press, tire flip, axle deadlift, and frame carry. And week 3, for example, here I might put axle press, barbell deadlift, keg toss, and field stone load. And so you see in any one of those weeks, it's well rounded, right? You're doing presses and carries and deadlifts and pulls and all those things. And then you're doing a completely new set the next week, right? This is something you could try in the off season, right? When you don't know the skills and you want to train more generally, or you're just somebody who likes training like strongman does, you want a lot of variety. This would be a really good way to cycle through those 14, foundational skills. So if you do this, I think it will, help you become a well-rounded athlete. But maybe there's a few extra notes I want to throw here. Just so you have them. This data here is based purely on historical data, right? So I did look across, I was 100 and something contests, amateur data in a 5-year period where I got this data from. So it's a lot of contests, but it's historical data and things change in the future. So it's entirely possible that those skills may not be foundational forever. It's highly unlikely because if you look at the professionals and you look across other time periods, it's like pretty consistent. But in the sport, there's no standards or rules, so people can choose, whatever they'd like. On top of that, they're foundational skills, but individualization should occur, right? So how you prioritize them, how much effort you put into each one, like still needs to happen, right? And then in most cases, each of those 3 microcycles I laid out, you'd probably be best to repeat them 2 or more weeks, right? To actually see a lot of gains in each skill. So if you just had those 3 microcycles like I laid out and you just went 1 week each something different, I guarantee you'll get pretty strong and well rounded. But if you cared about a certain one of those skills, you might not get as much strength gains as you would be training that same skill multiple weeks in a row and focusing on, recovering from that and building upon it next week. So that's something to consider that you might want to do with what I've proposed. And I've only discussed here really the motion pattern side of it. Like I mentioned in the other principles, there's the effort pattern side as well, right? So, how would you structure these in terms of effort pattern? So, how much time would you spend to fastest efforts, right? So, the book lays out some numbers there in terms of distribution. Again, you got to individualize, but just something to consider that part I didn't discuss, but I want you to know that you still better consider that. And the studies in Foundations of Strongman Training are there to give you a guideline from which to individualize. So, okay, I hope that kind of summarizes everything about that idea of prioritizing skills that are more often to occur in competition. And, if you have nowhere else to start with these foundational skills. All right, let's move on to the last one, principle number 5. All right. Principle number 5, something that is inherent to the sport of strongman. Train a large variety of strongman skills. There's no way around this if you want to win competitions, right? Now, of course, you're going to say, well, I did one contest and I won. Well, I'd probably challenge you and say that maybe you weren't competing at a level that you should have been, and that's why you won. Maybe you had prior experience on the events. Maybe the contest wasn't well run, or I've been in contests where, let's say, the scoring was subject to speculation about whether it was being done right or not. But anyways, in general, I will say you're not going to win or meet your goals if they're related to that unless you train a large variety of strongman skills. Now, variety is not only important for withstanding training demands generally, but obviously it's part of the sport. I keep talking here about, and it's because it's just part of it. Like, there's no standard for equipment, right? The implements, there's no standard for events. Organizers can choose whatever they want, they can change events whenever they want. And so you better be well rounded. You better practice a lot of skills so that you're ready for whatever they throw at you, right? Now, as I mentioned, in the study in chapter 2 of Foundations of Strongman Training, I found that there was 74 unique skills. And again, this is just the motion pattern side, not the effort pattern side. That data wasn't there in that data set in a 5-year period. So, that's a lot of skills. Now, one amateur wouldn't have competed at the 100 plus contests that happened across that 5-year period, right? So maybe they don't need to be really good at 74 skills or motion patterns, but I think it just highlights that there's the potential, to experience that variety of strongman skills. So, in order to kind of emphasize that this is an ongoing thing, I thought I would show you some newer data, since that data I had was, from 2015 to 2019 in terms of the study in chapter 2 there. So, what I want to show you is just look at the skill set that professional athletes would have had to compete, or would have had to compete in, just in the year of 2024 at the 6 kind of top shows for strong men in particular, which is the World's Strongest Man Heats and Finals, the Arnold Strongman Classic, the Magnus for Magnuson Strongman Classic, Rogue Invitational, and the Shaw Classic are now the strongest man on earth, right? And here, keep in mind, again, I'm not discussing the effort pattern dimension, so just the skill in terms of the motion pattern and the implement, right? Now, I'm not going to go through all these skills, but I'll show them here on the screen for you. But you can see that in 2024 alone, from just these 6 contests, there was 30 different skills that. So if you're a pro athlete, if you're Mitchell Hooper or Tom Stolman, and you were attending all of these contests, or most of them. There's 30 different skills that you would have had to master more than the other guys that are, they're fighting for the top spot, right? 30 is a lot of skills, right? When's the last time you tried to get better at 30 things in the same 12-month period? That's a lot, right? Now, you might be able to do that with skills that are less physically related, but try getting masterful at 30 different physical things to do with your body in a 12-month period. For those of you that are familiar with strongman or have tried something like that, you'll completely understand this. But you know another way to look at this is, because I'm sure some of you are already pushing back on this, I'm yelling at your screens right now, but you could get some increases in 30 skills in 1 year, but I would argue that those increases probably aren't meaningful. And especially if you're one of those guys I mentioned that's at the top, and where the meaning you're drawing is winning those top shows or being top three, or some kind of really high level goal where it's a huge demand on your body, right? So if you really suck at keg toss and you want to win the keg toss event at whatever, like the World's Strongest Man contest next year, good luck doing that, plus trying to master 29 other skills, even if you're already pretty good at them. It's just like probably impossible to do that many in a meaningful way, right? And this is, probably some of you who are beginners are like, well, I can name off 30 exercises that I improved, meant a lot to me last year in the gym. And it's like, yeah, if you're a beginner, and a meaningful increase on every lift is 5 pounds, which it should be, that there's nothing wrong with that, then sure, you meet this criteria. But what I'm really talking about here is the mindset and the principle around this that encompasses both at that level and all the way up to the extremes, right? So, enough harping on that. I hope you might get my point on that. So, in general, here, because it's so hard to increase so many skills, what I would recommend doing is start by building 3 skills each mesocycle and maintaining 2. Now, with proper workloads, something like this can happen year after year after year. It's how I've been able to do this for so long, right? Every week, I'm not just like, yeah, I'm going to all 14 foundational skills. We're getting it done, or I'm going to die trying, right? It's just like, yeah, and I would have died already, basically. But if you do something like that, where you just pick 3 skills, you're going to work the shit out of them, and 2 skills you're going to maintain. And so that means you're working at workloads and intensities that aren't super taxing, but you're still like keeping the technique proficient, right? So, like for example, say you're pretty good at tossing a keg or a sandbag, and that's one of your main maintenance skills, right? And so, like especially that, because the absolute weight is a lot lower than other skills, you can just throw that in there for a few sets every week, and you're going to maintain your proficiency. And then when it comes to contest, you're not going to need much time to ramp that up, right? You're good at it, just need to keep touching it, right, to get the feel, and build your confidence with it. And there you go. So that's the kind of idea there that I would, if you focus on 3 things in a week, that's more than enough for anybody, right? And again, I'm saying, not just for the beginner. Maybe there's an argument there that that's easy, but think about the top guys. Think about if I was telling Tom Stoltman what to do. It's like the amount of fatigue he can induce in his body across just 3 skills that he trains is like immense, right? So hopefully you understand that. Now, if you train 3 times per week, basically that means each session you would build one of those skills, and then 1 or 2 of those sessions you would maintain the other 2, right? And again, these skills don't have to be the same skills, right? Especially the maintenance ones. So imagine you want to build your log press, deadlift, and farmer's walk. Okay, those are your main skills you want to build. You're going to keep those for, let's say, 4 weeks at a time, and then you might still build them, but with variations in the next cycle and so on. But the maintenance skills, you could change those every week if you want. Whatever frequency you would need to maintain the skill, right? Some skills you might need, more touches on, right? And some you could touch every once a month or 6 weeks and you'd be fine, right? So that's kind of the idea there, is the maintenance skills you can just cycle in and out, and it leaves you like lots of time for attacking your weaknesses still, right? When you're only training those three skills. And then you can also get lots of variety, right? So whatever skills you're maintaining, or another way, training at lighter workload or lower workloads, just cycle those in, and that keeps your variety in, right? So it's like I'm hammering the things that I'm weak at and I need to improve, and then the things I'm already good at or that I'm not sure are coming up in contests, but they might. I'm just cycling through those. So there's lots of variety still going on in every week that you train, and that will help you, stay well rounded and stay prepared for the variety and uncertainty that's inherent in the sport, right? So if you did something like I said, where you just train three skills for a 4 week mesocycle, and you do that, a few, like, then you change the skills a few times a year. Across a year, those sets of three skills, you could actually build each of those sets up a fairly good amount across a year, right? Now, obviously, not the same as if you trained all those three skills all year round, and there's other, impediments to doing that. So you've got to have some variety. But yeah, I think that as a general recommendation or some place to start, that would be what I would recommend to you guys. So now, just to kind of summarize here, the key takeaway I want you to take away from Principle 5 is you just need to rotate skills frequently in order to stay well rounded, right? So that's the sport is varied, right? The skills are varied. There's nothing that's not changing anytime soon. Actually, it's one of the things that makes the sport entertaining, and it makes it pretty fun as an athlete to compete, but it also makes it fun to train, right? I've seen some people who train like a strongman, use strongman exercises, and it keeps them at the gym longer and therefore getting to their goals just because it's more fun, right? They can, like, instead of just getting tired of deadlifting a barbell, they can deadlift a sandbag, or right, or they can do like a yoke zercher walk. They can do like all kinds of cool stuff that we actually do get tested on in strongman, but it's just fun to train, right? And it just you're just hitting your body from different angles, and it keeps you, I guess, like I keep saying, in a well-rounded base of strength, right? So a couple more points here. First is that if you happen to rotate through all the equipment you have access to, the world's not over. There's literally an endless amount of skills and variations of skills that you can do in strongman. It's I don't know. I'd have to say it's like the most varied sport. I want to say strength sport, but when you think outside of that too, it's like, what other sport has the situation where you don't know what you're going to be tested on? And the amount of things to choose to be tested on is like seemingly infinite. Obviously, it's finite, but it's huge, right? So if you run out of variations, that has nothing to do with constraints of the sport. That's just your own fault, right? So that's, basically it's endless. You can always keep having fun and always keep finding ways to work around injuries and get the job done, right? Now, the another point here is that, like, there's a lot of variety. But if you think about what I talked about, motion pattern classes, where you say for example, all deadlift movement patterns can fit in this motion pattern class called deadlift, where the point is just to move something from the floor to hip height, right? In the off season, especially, as long as you're training a variant of deadlifts, all of your other deadlift variants, or the target skills you're working on are going to go up. Now they're not going to go up one to one always, right? Because the body does, produce force in specific ways, but they are going to go up to some degree. And there's going to be, in some of them, a pretty high carryover, right? So, like, there's a pretty high carryover between a barbell deadlift from the floor and an actual deadlift from the floor, right? And, but maybe there's less carryover between a barbell deadlift from the floor and a car deadlift, but there's still some, right? So, in the off season, I would say have fun with the variety, and I mean for fun's sake, but also because it will prepare you for the upcoming season. Which in the off season you have no idea when the contest will be, most likely, unless you're at the top levels, and you have no idea what the events will be, right? So as long if in the off season, if like one week you train an actual deadlift, next is barbell deadlift, next is a car deadlift, next is a trap bar deadlift, next is sandbag deadlift, and you just like rotate through those things, then I think first of all you're going to have fun, and secondly you're going to be pretty well rounded, right? As long as you approach all that in an intelligent manner. So yeah, that's basically a positive of the sport is it has a lot of variety, and as much as that is fun, it's also a difficult task, and that's why principle number 5 is you have to train a lot of variety of skills if you want to win. Well, with that, we reached the end of the principles. There was 5 principles. I laid them all out for you, gave you examples, my thoughts and recommendations. I know it was a lot to take in, but I hope you can understand that the sport has a lot of complexity, in it. And a lot of it has to do with the uncertainty of skills, events, promoters, all that stuff, right? So, but to kind of highlight things, I did share several examples. And I want to make one last point about that. I hope that you understand that the insights and recommendations I shared with you are just guidelines, okay? Nothing I've said takes away from the need to individualize training. I tried to throw in some examples from different ends of the spectrum and with different scenarios that might come up, whether you're a beginner, whether you're an advanced athlete. But in either case, use the data for what it is, a guideline, but please make sure that you individualize, right? So if you follow what's here and it doesn't work for you, it's probably because it doesn't fit your individual situation. Don't be mad at me, okay? I'm letting you know now. Now, if you need help with that, no problem. Happy to help. Just get a hold of me, okay, through Strength Intelligence, and I'm happy to see what I can do to help you optimize your training. So, but that's it. We've reached the end of the video series, right? But I wanted to tell you a little bit about future work here before we go on. So, in the future, I really hope that I'll be able to address individualization. I know I've spent this whole video series giving you kind of the um, general templates, recommendations, and obviously using the data from the scientific studies I performed. But I know at the end of the day, there'll be some training decisions that just are really, dependent on your unique situation. But I'm happy to do that one on one with you, but I can't do it on a more more robust method because first I need data. There is not a large public source of training data, especially people training for strongman, that's available to me, or that probably even exists right now, where I can go and like look through it and maybe do more scientific studies and draw conclusions from that. It just doesn't exist right now. So that brings me to my next project. I am building a training management system so that I can collect such data. Now, the good thing is at the same time, it'll help you manage your training, right? Help you collect, track, and analyze all your training data and optimize your training and individualize it. And then, that will help me get the data I need so that I can help you guys even more, right? With even more research insights. Now, that stuff's in the works. I'll share the details on our social media channels as it progresses. But that's going to be the next thing for me because this kind of realm of research. In order to go deeper into it, that's the data I need. So I need your data, but don't worry, I'm going to build the tools to collect it and obviously bring you guys some value with that. So, in closing here, I really hope you enjoyed this series. It's been a lot of fun for me to share my thoughts with you. It was quite a journey, as I mentioned throughout these episodes, to go from just this naive young strongman athlete trying to do the best I could with very little resources and make all those mistakes and research and everything and get all the way to this point where I got to share all of these thoughts and insights with all of you. Now I really hope the big takeaway here is that I really hope that the what I've shared with you will help you get to your goals faster with more fun and less injuries. And if that happens, I think that's all I could hope for with this. And if it does, let me know. I'd love to hear your stories about how any of this helped. Um, Getting that feedback from you just will help me improve and help me guide my research, the tools I'm building and everything to just bring more and more value to you guys and help you get to those places you want to get to. So if you want any more details about strength intelligence, if you want to pick up a copy of Foundations of Strongman Training, head over to strengthintelligence.ca, or you can contact me on Instagram at Strength Intelligence. Also, I've been putting up these videos and lots of other videos on our YouTube channel at Strength Intelligence. So lots of places for you to learn more and get in contact with me if you think I can help you. Okay? As always, thank you for your time and attention. I hope you learned something. Best of luck with your training. Take care.